Hi everyone, my name is David McNamara and I'm the founder and executive director of Samadhi. The word Samadhi, which when we first opened it, we got a lot of questions like, what is that? What language is that? What is that? So it's a Sanskrit word. It's over 4,000 years old, and it basically means, one of the meanings, it has many meanings, but the meaning that we adhere to is coming together through awareness and concentration. So, coming together as an individual, so I'm bringing the different parts, those of you that are in the psychology field, we have like parts work, right? We work with different parts. So bringing those different parts together to become a whole person, but also coming together as a community, right? How do we, because those of you that are in recovery, you know that we need community in order to recover. Like we need everybody. I also want to add that I am a person in long-term recovery for it was 18 years in March.
Awesome.
And thank you. And it's interesting. I mean, I learned so much today, and I really want to say too, I'm really, really grateful to be invited to be here and to be part of this and speak. And sometimes I have to say that sometimes I get really frustrated. I'm on a lot of committees and boards, and a lot of times I get really frustrated at the things that I hear in this very county, and it's interesting because we're like on the very edge of the western edge of the county, and I'm like, wow, this is like so refreshing and progressive, and so within my own recovery, I did the usual 12-step route in New York City about 20 years ago. And it was great. It saved my life. As Julie was saying before. I mean, we're not throwing out any particular pathway, but what I did see was that was not going to work for me long term. It was not something that was going to sustain me for the next 20 years. And I just had this image of like sitting in diners with people in New York City for 20 years, and I was like, I can't. And I don't mean to put that down because it was something great about that too. But I was like, there needs to be something more. And it's interesting because so many times today we've heard people talk about the trauma that's inherent in the underlying cause of our addiction, right? Is this trauma? And I remember as a teenager, being so frustrated and so angry and just saying, like, I don't know why I use. Every time I'd have to come home and I'd be gone for 2 days and my mother would scream and flip out because she was scared. She was frightened that I was dead, and I felt horrible. I felt horrible to put her through that, but I didn't know why. I didn't know, and I just said, well, there must be something wrong with me. And I found lots of people to tell me there was something wrong with me. Our advisory board member and kind of friend of mine, Gabor Mate, he will say, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, And when I started to think about that and hear that, and I remember going to the 12-step group or going in rehab and saying, well, I think there's trauma at the root of my addiction. And back then people would be like, oh yeah, no, I think that's probably right. So anyway, let's work on your recovery. I was like, yeah, but I don't know, and we would, we do relapse prevention. I mean, when I worked in rehabs for 4.5, 5 years, and we'd run these relapse prevention groups and anger management, and I was like, well, I don't, like, how do you work on relapse prevention if I don't know where my triggers come from?
Good point.
I have no idea where my triggers come from. So I knew that something was missing, and I didn't know exactly how to get there. So I started this journey, and in 2015, I'm also a filmmaker for many years. I started a film after my son's best friend died of a heroin overdose. And I started to make a film called Disconnected. I'm still working on it. It's not finished yet, but we're going to have a partial screening, I think, at the end of the summer. And in that film, I went and I interviewed, that's when I first met Gabor Mate. I interviewed Gabor Mate, I interviewed Dr. Andrew Tatarski, Vilma Sara, Dr. Valerie Mason-John, and these people have all become part of Samadhi now. Everybody that I interviewed became like board members and advisory board members. But what I started to see, and we also have talked about the disparities of financial status and where you are on the economic scale and the color of your skin and I thought, well, if I have $8,000 to go to Costa Rica, I could spend the week with Gabor Mate. But most of the people that I serve and me can't afford to do that, So I was like, well, how can I bring some of these wonderful things that I'm learning to everybody? So initially, my plan was, I went back to school, became a CASAC, and I thought, well, I'm going to work in rehabs, and I'm going to see what they're doing in rehabs. And it was kind of like an investigative reporter. So those 4 years, I would just ask everybody who worked there, what do you do? What do you do? You're a Serpa? Tell me what that is. Or you work in billing? Okay, tell me about that. Or you're a nurse? And I went through and I was like, okay, and I looked at what was working and what was not working from my viewpoint. And then I set out to do those things. And I said, well, okay, now I've got all this information. I'm going to open an inpatient treatment center, not knowing the what Oasis actually was, right? It's just like so. Nearly 3 years later, we just, on October 15th of last year, we received our license to open an outpatient clinic because the bear of opening an inpatient clinic, which is still a goal, and we will do it at some point, but, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot in working through that. One of the things I learned was that Oasis is a huge proponent of harm reduction. And all these rehabs that I worked at, it wasn't, they would always blame it on Oasis. And I was like, no, it's not Oasis, it's the rehab. It's the rehab being very, when they would throw people out if they were pregnant in a rehab because they said there was a higher level of care. And I'm like, they're only going to be here for 14 days. Like what, right. what exactly is going to happen in the first 14 days of a pregnancy? That's, so basically that like, writing and rewriting the application, I was like, wait a minute, they're supportive of a lot of the ideas, a lot of the things that I want to bring. So so that kind of set me on this journey. So anyway, I was like, well, it looks like this. Oasis told me it was going to be 6 to 9 months for the application. It ended up being like 3 years. So I was like, well, what am I going to do for those 6 to 9 months while I'm, and around that time, a friend of mine he's actually a neon artist in Kingston, and I was telling him about all my ideas, and he said, I have this friend that has this building that's part of a church that I could probably get for you. I think that you could get it really cheap. And I went and I met with her, and it was $1,000 a month, and I basically took $12,000 out of my savings, and I said, okay, I can rent this building for 12 months. We got that. And then we had a couple of volunteer meetings, and we said, we basically put it out there on social media and, just talked to people and said, how many people are interested in looking at a different way of treating addiction? And 37 people showed up to volunteer, and it was in February, and it was an ice storm. And I was kind of like, okay, if 37 people showed up in an ice storm, I think maybe we got something here, right? And so the first year and a half, everybody was volunteer. I was still working in a rehab. I was working 53 hours a week at a rehab, and then I'd work another 45 hours a week at Samadhi to get it going. Wow. And that became the Samadhi Recovery Community Outreach Center, right? The original, the first building on Clinton Avenue. We went from serving, I think it was 41 people a month to 206 people a month in 3 months. And it was like triage. I mean, it was like an emergency room because we were right on the corner, in a neighborhood where there was a lot of drug use, there were a lot of drug sales, there was gang violence, and I loved it. It was incredible. I mean, the things that we learned, and Cherry's from that neighborhood, and she was one of the people that kept me going. But she's like, I know everybody's out to get you, but I believe you. And, because of stigma, because of misunderstanding, there were all these rumors that we were giving people drugs. These rumors still go on today, and, because we would put people on medication-assisted treatment. And I said, well, no, we're not giving people drugs. We're helping people get into treatment and find what it was that they needed. And through that process of having that outreach center, we started to notice, well, what's actually needed. So the first thing that was needed was that, people didn't know how to get into treatment. If somebody was, for somebody to go from being homeless to getting into treatment is a big step. And that's around the time when I said, well, okay, but the people that are working for us, these volunteers need training. They need training to understand how they're working with people who are maybe considering going into treatment. Maybe they're on the very edge, and maybe there's like 3% of them is like, yeah, maybe treatment, but really I just want to go use. I'm gonna, we had two drug houses, one on the street right here and one a block away from us, and we were here. So basically people would like go back and forth, and that one day they would walk by the center and they were like, well, maybe I'll go in this place instead of going to the drug house today. Let me just see what happens. So that's the time that we created the Samadhi educational program and the SERPA Certified Recovery Peer Advocate training program. Does everybody here know what a SERPA is? Aaron, you know? So Aaron did that training, Jason did that training. I'm sure a number of other people in this room have done that training. And I used to teach the training by myself for the first 2 years. I think I've trained 137 people. I think we're up to like 170 something now. And actually some of the people that I trained are now trainers, and they're training other people, which is a beautiful thing when it kind of expands out like that. So once we started the SERPA training, then we started to meet all these people. Like I met Jason, in Delaware County, and I met all these different people that were just really, really amazing, unique individuals, and that kind of informed like the kinds of things that we could do, because different people were interested in different things. One person might be a veteran, one person is coming out of incarceration. So when a person walks into Samadhi and says, I just got out of prison, and I'm like, you know what, I want you to meet John. Because John is a Serpa who has experience with incarceration. We have other Serpas who have a lot of experience with Child Protective Services. So if somebody has just lost their child to Child Protective Services or is trying to get their children back, someone like Amber, or we have another Serpa named Helen, who has a lot of experience, then we'll because they have that lived experience. I haven't been through that process myself with CPS, but she has, right? So we started to say, okay, so not only do we need Serpas, but we need specifically trained Serpas. When Julia came and talked to me about the neonatal program, I was like, oh my God, I'm like, this is incredible. This is an incredible opportunity. And we keep looking at that. We're talking to veterans now. We're talking to, all these different groups and figuring out different ways that we can create, opportunities like that. So the outreach center expanded, and then at a certain point, we had a lot of criticism in the neighborhood because they said that we were bringing people there who used drugs. We were actually,
I did.
Yeah. So did everybody. Yeah.
Good article, right?
Yeah. They even try to like remind people of that, like they're like, oh yeah, here we go. We just got a big grant, and they were like, oh, and also, this had last year they said this. I was like, yeah, let's just keep reminding people about that. Yeah, so it got to the point where it was like every day I was going to city council meetings and town halls and defending our grants at the legislature, and I just said, well, this isn't really what I set out to do. So one of our funders was like, if we were able to help you to purchase a building, would you be able to move from there? And I said, well, I said I prefer not to, because the location was really ideal, and I can think of 3 people off the top of my head that we've lost in the last year and a half, because when the new location we moved to is a little bit on the outskirts of town. I didn't think anybody would walk there. I was wrong. A lot of people walk there, but not everybody will walk there. And people who are still in active use don't really want to be that far from the neighborhood where they can get drugs. Where the Samadhi Center is now is not an area where you can get drugs readily. So, so we moved the outreach center, to that area. It's 150 Sawkill Road, and it's a 5,000 square foot center, which we're very proud of, and is beautiful and wonderful, and it's 24/7. There's a basically what used to be the waiting room. It was a medical building, I think, at one time. So what used to be the waiting room is basically like the community room. So people come in and you can be in active use. You can be thinking about stopping, thinking about not stopping. I need a place to live. I want some food. We have a refrigerator. We have coffee. We have water. We have, and then we have our wonderful Sherpas, right? Like Aaron is there, and we've got 7 or 8 other staff members. So so basically, that became established, and that became a place and that's where we do the trainings. That's where we run about 65 hours of programming, free programming a week. So recovery groups and nonviolent communication, refuge recovery, 8-step recovery, a number of different programs, and a lot of alternative programs too. Like somebody said before, we're talking about multiple pathways of recovery. So in the process of us moving around that time, one of the we call the people that we serve community members. We don't call them clients or patients, or we call them community members. And around the time of right before the move, one of our community members was shot and killed on Liberty Street, right around the corner from us, and it was mistaken identity. And the person that they wanted to kill was also one of our clients. So at that point, I had a conversation with Senator Michelle Hinchy, and I said, I think I want to start an anti-gun violence program. And she said, well, why do you think you're the right people? And I said, well, we're involved in it. I said, we're in the middle of it. I said, guns and drugs are kind of, hand in hand with a lot of stuff. So at that time, Congressman Delgado and Senator Hinchy, basically said, yeah, let's do this. And so now we have the Samadhi. We just call it the Samadhi Anti-Violence Program, which is on. It's nearby. It's on St. James Street, so it's still in that same neighborhood. And again, what we were talking about all day. I mean, that was such an amazing presentation this morning about trauma-informed care. Are you still? Oh yeah, you're still here. Well, I mean, one of the best presentations, and I've seen many presentations on ACEs and trauma-informed care, and just really, really powerful. But that ACEs and trauma response is involved in all forms of violence. Not just gun violence, but anything. Just as it is an addiction. So we formed that program. We started the outreach center. At the new location, and then we got our license for our outpatient clinic. So then we started our outpatient clinic. Our outpatient clinic is also mindfulness-based, harm reduction-based. We are the only nonprofit outpatient clinic in Ulster County, which means that we will take people, that have insurance. We'll take people without insurance. Sliding scale. We have the only Spanish language program in Ulster County. Many of those folks don't have insurance. And it's really interesting too, because when we started operations, some of the folks some of the clinicians that are working there, have been in the business for a really long time, and they said, well, you can't have people come in that are high. And I said, well, I don't understand. I said, treatment. I said, why would we not treat people, And we were talking about having separate groups, like having more harm reduction based groups, and so it's not triggering to people, but. It is, it's interesting because that is the general consensus, where people are not accepted into treatment if they come in, where they're high. So basically, what we did in that so basically, every time something was presented, I was like, okay, well, I guess we should do that now. I guess we need to do that as well. So this is what kept happening. So now the outpatient is about to double in size, and we're also opening an outpatient detox center that's going to be part of the same program. This will also allow access to buprenorphine, to Suboxone, to MAT. we have hired Dr. Maya Hambright full-time, who is I think the largest private provider of MAT in Ulster County for sure, but maybe in the Hudson Valley. So it's really great because a lot of the clients that she brings with her, we kind of went from, I think we had 10 people the first week, and we've got 103 people inside of like a month and a half. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So one of the things that I think you all do differently, and I'd like to understand how you infuse it, is the idea of mindfulness. And so how do you build that in, and how do you, for this practitioner, for this physician, how do you get them on board, and what do you mean by mindfulness?
That's a good question. Yeah. So, let's do a very quick little exercise. So I want everybody just kind of sit in your seat. It's helpful if your feet are on the floor. And just take a moment just to kind of take in the room, not in any kind of a judgmental way, but just kind of noticing your environment. Just kind of, oh look, there I am on the big screen. Yeah, so just kind of take in where you are. Feel your feet on the floor. Feel the weight of your body in the chair. And now just feel as if you have a string at the top of your head and you're being suspended from the ceiling. And then just see if you can just notice your breath. And just keep your attention just on the simple act of breathing. And you may notice it at the base of the nostrils or in the rising and falling of the stomach or abdomen. Either place is okay. And just notice it. And you may find as you try to stay with the breath, it's not so easy. You might get taken away by thoughts or feelings, or things may distract you. And that's okay. We don't want to try to stop those. Just let them come and let them go. And just focus on your breath. And now I want everyone to slowly open their eyes. And I want everybody to make a fist, a really tight fist. So what do you notice? What do you notice about your breath? Stop breathing, right? You stop breathing. So that's just an example of mindfulness. We were being mindful. We were noticing our breath. When we were noticing your breath, did anybody notice a settling in their body, right? In the minute, all I had to do was this, and it all went away in an instant, right? So, addiction is automatic. It's compulsive. It's reactive. We don't know where it comes from. Right, because it's a trauma response. So just in that way, I could wake up and say, wow, it's a beautiful day, it's great, and I walk into work and my boss says, I don't like the way you did that thing, and all of a sudden this happens, right? And now at lunchtime, somebody else says something to you, and now we've got, before we were talking about complex trauma, right? So now those two things, and it's like, and then the inner critic comes in and says, David, you always screw up. You always do this all the time, right? So now so we got, so eventually what's going to happen?
Explode.
You're going to explode, right? I'm like a tea kettle, and it's like, right, I got to go. So when I explode, I'm going to reach for what I know will give me relief. Whether that is, in my case, it was cocaine, alcohol, right? I'm going to reach for that. And it's going to work. It does work, right? Anybody here who's ever dealt with addiction knows that it works. But then it doesn't. Then it wears off. So it's like, okay, well, if I want to, and then I get tight again, and I'm like, well, I got to, and hence the cycle, right? That we go into that cycle. So what I was saying before about the word samadhi, about developing awareness. So when I become aware of the fact that I am reacting to things that quite often are outside of my control. Usually they're out of my control. Situations and things that happen. If I become reactive and I become combative, then I'm going to reach for whatever it is that gives me relief. And we see this. It's really interesting. Gabor said to me one time. He said the addiction is not in the drug. He said everybody is like, oh, it's because of this cocaine. Oh, it's because of this heroin. Oh, it's because of fentanyl. It's because of, if the addiction were in the drug itself, anyone who ever tried an illegal substance would become addicted. True. Right? And we know that out of all the people that try an illegal drug, less than 10% actually become addicted. Because if I don't have, some type of a trauma in my body, the first time that I tried cocaine, I remember immediately, I had a lot of self-deprecating thoughts. My father abandoned me when I was a kid, and my mother and I was sexually abused, and so I was in high school. I was just one of those, like, I don't want to look at anybody. Yeah. The first time I tried cocaine, my shoulders went back, and I was like, I'll be king of the world. Mm-hmm. I felt empowered. I felt sure. So why would I not want to feel like that every day? And of course I started to realize how much money cocaine costs. This is in the 1980s too, so it was a lot of money back then. And but I mean, my point is that I learned that when I don't feel good, I can take this one thing and I can feel good. So why wouldn't I want to do that, right? Because people, I hear all these things, like fuck heroin, and I was like, oh, okay, great, but it's not about the heroin, until we look at what's happening inside of ourselves. So, to answer your question, mindfulness is the way that we develop awareness. So that's the first step. The first step in Mindfulness-Based Addiction Recovery, which is a program that was started by Dr. Valerie Mason-John that we use at Samadhi. The first step is a body scan. So we literally start with your big toe on your right foot, and we go through each part of the body. And basically what it does is it teaches you how to notice sensations in your body. Because especially those of us that have used drugs for a long period of time, the whole point was to get numb, to not feel anything in our bodies, right? So we have to teach ourselves again how to become aware, how to notice a trigger. When I'm walking down the street and somebody looks at me a certain way, and there's like this, for me, like this shoulder will go up a little bit, right? And I know I'm like, huh. I don't know that person. I don't know anything about him, but something happened. There was a little trigger there. So when I notice that, a lot of times in rehab and in 12-step groups, they'll say, the relapse happens a week before you pick up. And I agree 100%, but they never tell you how to figure that part out. Like what am I, okay, but, so mindfulness is actually the way that we notice that, because everybody always feels like, anybody who's ever used drugs, it feels like, I made up my mind I wasn't going to use, and I was on the bus, and I heard this song, and then next thing I know I was at my dealer's door. And it feels like it's automatic, like, or, the person is like, all of a sudden I was in the bar, and I was like walking down the street, and I didn't want to go to the bar. I'm like, why am I in the bar? Almost 30 years ago now, Dr. Andrew Tatarsky, who's on our board of directors, and he was my therapist. And this is before anybody talked about harm reduction. This is literally like 28 years ago. And I remember going in, and I had returned to cocaine use and crack use, and my wife at the time had left and gone to her mother's house, and I went to his office and I said, I'm a piece of shit, I'm no good, and he's like, really? He said, I'm just really curious. He said, because, the last time you were here, you said you really didn't want to use drugs and alcohol, but you did. And he's like, aren't you curious about why that is and what happened, And I was like, yeah. And that's when I first started to, look at underlying causes, look at trauma, It's really funny because all the people that come into our outpatient clinic, they'll come in and somebody said this before, like, I think it was Laura? Yes. That when you treat people with kindness and compassion and focus, like in Serpa training where we talk about mindful awareness, right? And people come out of my office and they're just like, oh my God. And the people who work in the office are like, what did you do? And I was like, I just listened to them. I just listened to them and I treated them with compassion and with respect and with dignity. And people will say to me too, they're like, you guys never talk about drugs. They're like, this is the weirdest rehab. Like nobody ever talks about drugs. And I said, we can talk about drugs if you want to. And they're like, no, I don't want to, but every rehab I've ever gone to, everybody talks about drugs. And I said, well, the drugs aren't the cause of the addiction. I said, it's what's underlying, it's what's underneath, So that became my focus. And I said, well, we keep talking about trauma-informed care, which is very important. But I was like, but what are we doing to actually treat the trauma, to work with the trauma? And at that point, that's when I discovered that we needed to really focus in. The training that Julia was talking about before is called somatic experiencing. So that's one of the primary practices that we do at Samadhi. And my goal is to have every staff member, every team member at Samadhi trained in somatic experiencing. I think we got about a third so far. Yeah. And then there's also something called integral somatic psychology. So these are different ways of learning how to embody emotions, learning how to feel what's in the body. So people come into my office and I said, well, what's going on? What are you feeling? I just feel, ugh. And I said, okay. Because a lot of times you go into a rehab and they're like, well, what is the emotion that, define what that emotion is. And the person's like, I don't know, So whatever somebody comes in with, if they say, I feel, I said, okay, good. Where do you feel in the body anywhere? Yeah, I feel it right here. Oh, okay. So let's just notice, I just want you to let yourself feel that. Because a lot of times people have never let themselves feel an emotion. In 12 steps, there's one saying that makes me completely crazy, and it's move a muscle, change a thought. And I'm like, no, don't change the thought. Like in addiction, the only way to recovery, you can't go around it, you can't go above it, you can't go underneath it, you have to go through. And however you find a way to do that, the thing about these trauma healing therapies is that you're actually you're using invitational language to give the person a way to explore and experience what that is in their body. And people have, amazing breakthroughs because all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, people will come in and they'll say, oh man, I relapsed. And I said, oh, what happened right before that? Well, I was getting dressed. I had a guy that was coming to treatment and he knew we were going to do trauma work and he didn't show up. And so I asked the office to call him, and he was in his driveway. He had drank after 6 months. He drank whatever he could find in the house, and he was in his driveway, in his pickup truck, about to go to the liquor store to buy more booze. And I said, get him on the phone, let me talk to him, And I said, what? And he's like, I don't know, it just happened, it was just like out of the blue. And I said, okay. I said, what were you doing? And he said, well, I was getting dressed to come to see you. And I said, okay. I said, so anything happened when you were getting dressed? And he's like, well, it's really weird because my hand started shaking when I was like buttoning up my shirt. And I said, yeah. And I said, what do you think? And, we went through this whole thing and he said, because I don't want to come talk to you about my trauma.
I was afraid.
Yeah, he said, I was afraid. And I said, yeah. And I said, that makes complete sense. And long story short, we were able to identify, and it was something really big that he wanted to tell me, but he was also afraid to tell me. So, long story short, I got him to get out of the truck, wait for his wife to come home. He came in, later that night. We had a session, but the point being is that addiction is the result of the inability to know how to feel safe. Right? I was going to say that one more time because it's really, really important to me. But addiction is the result of the inability to know how to feel safe. When I don't know how to feel safe in my body or in my environment or around the people, we talked a lot before about intergenerational trauma. There are many of us, because of race, because of gender, that don't feel comfortable in a lot of environments, right? Or we don't feel comfortable, because of things that happened to us in our childhood. And when I don't feel safe, I need to do something in order to feel safe. heroin to somebody who's never used heroin doesn't seem safe, but to someone who's used heroin, it's very safe. In the 1950s, they used to call it mother, right? Because it wraps you like a warm blanket, right? So basically, you know, whatever it is that I need to feel safe. And the thing is that when I'm in that situation where I don't feel safe or I don't feel comfortable in my own body, you know, I'm going to do anything to feel comfortable in my own body. And, you know, so what if there was a way to create, you know, tools and give people information that they could learn how to feel comfortable in their own body. So learning, you know, how to find resources, how to be comfortable in my own body, right? You know, that's kind of the key. And why mindfulness is important is that until I learn how to notice sensations in my body, how to notice my emotions, you know, how to notice, you know, outside forces, it's really, really hard for me to start to do this trauma work. You know, I need a certain level of awareness and connection in order to start to feel this. So this process of learning how to notice, you know, what I'm feeling in my body, you know, when I'm triggered, you know, you know, a lot of times people come in and, you know, we'll talk about where they're at, what's going on, you know, because rather than, you know, having an agenda and saying, you know, well, we're going to talk about your relapse, we're going to talk about this, and at a certain point, I will ask somebody, you know, about their use and how it's been going. And a lot of times they're embarrassed, and I said, you don't have to be embarrassed. You can tell me whatever, you know, whatever is going on, but let's look at what happened. If you didn't want to use and you used, like, there's got to be, you know, something that, you know, and usually people will be like, nope, there's nothing. It just happened out of the blue. And I'm like, okay, you know, and eventually they'll be like, oh, you know what? There was this one thing that happened. You know, there was this one sound that I heard, or this, you know, somebody called me on the phone that I hadn't talked to in a long time, and right. And again, like we keep saying, you know, with complex trauma, all those things build together, and it gets to the point where, like you said, then you want to explode. You know, you just want to. So this process of developing the capacity to be able to be with emotions. You know, there's something called affect tolerance in dialectical behavioral therapy, which is emotional tolerance. So if I have anxiety, you know, I forget the statistic before, but it was like half the country suffers from anxiety use disorder, right? And so let's say I have anxiety, and it's this, you know, a lot of times it tends to be like a ball, like right here on the bottom of my throat, right? And that ball becomes so intense and so, I can't stand it. I need to get out of it. Now there are ways that I can expand that. You know, the first time I asked somebody to expand, you know, anger or fear, they're like, no, I don't want to do that. And it's like, trust me, let's try it. If it's okay, I want you to try it. And what happens is that we create more capacity in the body. So now I have a bigger container to be able to hold that anxiety. So now they have a tool. They have a tool that they can use, you know, as opposed to, like, you know, in rehab, you know, I remember people telling me, well, you have an urge or a craving, just ignore it. Go for a walk, you know, and I'm like, okay, apparently you've never used drugs. I'm like, I don't know. I was like, I'll go for a walk to my dealer's house. I was like, I don't know. But basically there's something that we do, a technique that we use at the outpatient clinic called urge surfing. And it was, Andrew Tatarsky taught it to me, and it was a gentleman named Alan Marlatt, who's one of the fathers of harm reduction. He developed this originally. And basically what it is that we don't want to, we never want to ignore the urge. You know, so if an urge comes up and says, I really need a drink, I can't handle this, I need a drink right now, or I need some Coke, or I need whatever it is. What does that urge want? Because if I try to ignore it, or I try to say, you know, oh, that's a negative feeling, and I'm going to block it, or, you know, it's just there. It's going to keep popping up. But if I acknowledge it and I respect it, and I say, okay, well, what is it that the urge wants? And this is a process that we teach people. And ultimately, like, if I have an urge to use heroin, you know, the urge is not really to use heroin. The urge is for relief. Comfort, right? Comfort, relief. So it's like, okay, so it wants comfort and relief. Like, what else gives you comfort and relief? You know, I had somebody that wanted to go buy street methadone, and we went through this whole process, and I somatically, I had him explain to me what what methadone. I said, I've never taken methadone. I don't know what it feels like. So I said, let's go through the process. And so somatically, we spent about 40 minutes of him explaining it and feeling it in his body, and he could feel it in his body. Wow. He basically felt, and he's kind of like, what did you just do? But it was interesting, as I said, is there any other time that you have that feeling? And he said, yeah, when I go to my mother's house. When I go to my mother's house. And I said, well, okay. I said, so there's a resource. So creating resources for people, not just telling people to go for a walk or take a deep breath, or because it's not that simple, but the resource has to be something that the person themselves identifies with. I have one person, it's like their cat. They just imagine their cat. They'll come into my office like, oh, and we'll resource them. We'll talk about their cat, and right away it just kind of gives them a level. And I do this, we do this with EMDR as well. Have you heard of EMDR? So EMDR is another trauma therapy that basically, it uses what's called bilateral stimulation. I'm not going to get too into the whole thing, but you've got the right and left hemisphere of your brain. The trauma is held in the right side. That's where the images and the truth and feelings and emotions are held. And the left side is a cognitive part where we tell stories. And, so it gets the two sides to talk to one another by kind of going through the trauma. But the tapping process of these resources, so it's like who is your protector, who is your nurturer, Well, my aunt who died when I was a little kid, was basically made me feel safe. Okay, so let's be with your aunt for a minute, and then there's like a series of tapping, so that becomes part. It becomes embodied. It's not just I'm not just saying like go to your special place. Yeah. It's not that, but it actually becomes embodied.
Framing the trauma.
Exactly.
What
Exactly.
those tapping and MTR are supposed to do is you kind of experience it, but then you reframe it by using those methods.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and but even without doing a full EMDR session, you can even just tap in resources.
Absolutely.
And with addiction, it's super helpful. I mean, it's really because people don't think of any other resources. The only resource they've ever known, especially if you've grown up in a house where you've watched your mother and father, when they got stressed out, they went and reached for a substance. So it's like, well, that's what you do when that happens, right? And they don't even realize that they have resources. So helping them to develop resources that are their own, that they find themselves. These are really, really important. So I guess I'm going to leave some time for questions.
Anyone have any questions?
Are all of your staff trained in mindfulness?
Yes, all of our whole team is trained in mindfulness. Yeah, and many of our team members also run meditation groups at the center. Right. I used to run all the groups myself, but we've got 37 employees now, so I can't do that.
I just want to know where you're located and how do I get an appointment?
So we're at 150 Sawkill is where our outreach center is. 150 Sawkill Ave in Kingston, New York.
How would we go about signing up for a class if we were interested?
So basically we have something called implicit psychology, which is Abby Blakesley, who's a very senior teacher within the SE framework, and she's going to pilot this program at Samadhi. So I'm extremely excited. So July 7th through the 10th, I'll send it out because I want to send out a mass email to everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will share your resources too,
Yeah.
for folks who are interested. Questions, ideas, reactions?
I just think it's amazing work that you're doing, and thank you. Yeah, just amazing.
I see a question from Laura.
Thanks. Also really appreciating all of this and the framing of it and everything. I was just curious on a logistical level, when you named kind of the pros and cons of having had to leave the area that you were in before and move to the new place, and just curious if there's like attempts to incorporate like outreach in some of those, places where you had been before, and just how you're navigating like the balance between the joy of having like the space to yourself and then the access questions.
Right. Well, it's really interesting. That's a great question. It was what happened when we moved out. There was another organization that took over a laundromat in the middle of town, and behind the laundromat were about 25 to 30 homeless folks. About 40% of the people we serve are homeless. So there are about 25 or 30 homeless folks that were behind this, and this was not a regular laundromat. It was like they were going to do this. They are doing this community, engagement and everything else. And I said, what are you going to do about all the folks that live behind the bubble that have been living back there for 4 years? And they're like, oh yeah, it'll be fine. Well, and the first weekend they were like calling us every 5 minutes, and they were like, could you send somebody over because we know all the people. And it got to be like a regular thing. And I said, okay, well, you know what? You can hire one of our peers to be there. So now we have a team. We have like 3 people that are there. So that's like right smack in the middle of. It's the same people we used to serve on Clinton Avenue, and they're there now. So we basically are there. We've been invited back into because they're like, well, we got to call Samadhi. Nobody else wants to.
Full circle.
Yeah, because they had overdoses, and somebody, and then they were locking their bathroom doors and only letting certain people. And I'm like, you're gonna have a real problem. I said, because it's a public restroom, and you can't, it's like either it's a public restroom or it's not, and it can't be public for some people, and so.
So how do you handle the criticism? Because you've been doing a lot of that, right? So like, how do you sort of, when folks say, hey, you're enabling drug use, those people shouldn't be in my neighborhood, et cetera. Because I want you to give us tools for how we can do it too.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that too. We also opened an emergency housing facility in Saugerties, New York, with 28 rooms. So we're starting that process again where, the town wants to know what are we doing, what are we, because they read that stuff in the paper, When there's criticism, what I do is I ask people to come and visit, and I will personally take you on a tour. In the case of the emergency housing, I'm going to call it an emergency housing community because we have community meals every Sunday. We have a garden. We have a 7-bed garden that we just built. We have projects where we're building meditation benches for Zen Mountain Monastery. And I said, I would really like it if people came. I said, because I can tell you everything that we're doing, and I can tell you, what our rules and regulations are. And I said, but basically, it's really easy to objectify people if you don't have a face, right? I could say, oh, Jason, yeah, he's a drug addict. Or I can be like, oh wow, there's Jason. He's a person, and I got to know a little bit about him now, and now I can't. It's not so easy for me to objectify. It's kind of impossible because now he's a human being. So that's my main goal is I don't ever push against because I understand it. When we were on Clinton Avenue, people would be like, well, how would you like this in your neighborhood? And it's a valid point, and I get it. But I wasn't bringing anything to the neighborhood. I was trying to help what was happening in the neighborhood. But it's all how you see it. Everyone's going to have a different perspective. But I think bringing it in and saying, these are human beings and they're dying. We lost 71 people last year in Ulster County. I mean, that's an enormous amount of. We're not a big county, and that can't happen.
No.
That just can't happen. So I want to put faces to these roles that we assign people of addict and criminal and everything else, and then really I think that really starts to break down those walls and those barriers.
Do you serve families or do you provide support for families?
Yeah, we do.
Service families?
We do.
Okay. Besides that. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's something that we actually want to build. We want to build on that even more. We were talking earlier. I was talking to Jillian, who works with the county, and we were talking about actually having more. We want to do a summit like this, only much larger at our site on Sawkill. And have one of the forums be specifically for families, for people who have lost people in their family, because it always gets overlooked. It's always about the people who are addicted, but we don't really have we have groups and stuff for families, but I think families' stories are really, really important. The people that I treat at the clinic, because we don't have any stigmatizing language, and we don't have any accusatory or biased language, but I will say that you're as you were going through your addiction, it did cause damage, and it was unintentional, and it wasn't anything that you meant, and it wasn't your fault, but at the same time, so it wasn't your fault, but it did cause damage. Both of those things are true. So I think that's really important and needs to be looked at. And because without everybody's involvement, without the whole community, it doesn't work. We've seen what happens with siloed treatment and it hasn't been working. So, somebody said to me, Andrew Tatarski said to me a couple of weeks ago at a thing in New York City, and he goes, you're like a harm reduction mogul. I was like, I always think about money. I was like, I'm a poor mogul. But I guess what I'm saying is that what I realized is it wasn't just about creating a treatment center, it was about creating a system, which wasn't my initial intention, but that is kind of what was handed to me.
Mindfulness-based recovery presentation, yeah.
Thank you.